Right. So, welcome to our session, our workshop on funding and scholarships. Um, I'll just quickly take you through the outline, which is basically I'll tell you a little bit about Project Edu Access and OPP, and I'll introduce your panelists, after which your panelists will then take you through three key aspects of funding and scholarships, which are internal funding, external fundings, and specifically, Talha will talk to you about OPP scholarships as well, which will then be followed by the Q&A. So Project Edu Access aims to make the higher education landscape more inclusive in the UK. We do so by four key interventions, which include mentoring, counseling, and role modeling, information, advice, and guidance, capacity building and leadership skill development, and evidence based advocacy. This particular workshop series has been brought to you by Edu Access in collaboration with the Oxford Pakistan program. The Oxford Pakistan program is a first of its kind initiative that aims to increase the representation of Pakistani scholars and research, as well as Pakistan related activities at the University of Oxford and UK higher education in general. I think Talha will be speaking more about that today, so I'll just move ahead. This is our fourth workshop in this 10-part workshop series. We have two other workshops coming up next weekend on navigating standardized tests and writing statement of purposes. We'll share the details as always, so we hope to see you there as well. Um, so today we have two wonderful panelists. We have Hamza Adnan, who has done his MSc, who's doing his MSc in Advanced Computer Science from the University of Oxford, and then we have Talha Pirzada, who has completed his DPhil in Aerospace Engineering, also from the University of Oxford. So between them, I think they can cover all the queries that you may have on DPhil or MSc. Right, so I'll just quickly take you over some basics of internal funding, and then I'll allow the panelists to expand further. Um, sorry. So first question obviously is, how do you actually look for funding? How do you know what opportunities are available? So for that, so firstly, there are two key types of funding, and then there are a couple of other sources that you can look into. The two key sources are internal funding and external funding. By internal funding, we mean the funding that is given usually by either the department or the university itself. These are university-wide and university level scholarships. And then there are also in collegiate universities like the University of Oxford, there are some scholarships that are specifically given by a particular college. And then there are external funding sources. So, for instance, the most popular one, I think, that a lot of you would have heard about are funding sources that are given by the government. So, for instance, Evening Scholarship, other such scholarships in Europe, Commonwealth scholarships, and then there are scholarships that are given by separate trusts. So, for example, the Rhodes Trust is a big one. Then there's some by Aga Khan Foundation, etc. And then, particularly in STEM, there are a lot of corporate sponsorships. So, for example, let's say the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is doing a project on vaccination in Pakistan. So, they might have particular funding available for doctoral students who are working in that specific field. And then there are also studentships and part time jobs. They're usually used to supplement um, funding if you already have your tuition fees covered. Um, and then there are another source that has been more common in recent years is crowdfunding through forums like GoFundMe, etc. Um, so how do you actually look for these funding sources? So starting with internal funding, the key word here is research. Unfortunately, there's no shortcut, there's no other way. There is no one platform for either, not even a single university or country in most cases, where you can find a list of all the scholarships that are available to you. So mostly you'll have to individually and manually go through every program, every department, every university, every country that you're applying to. In some cases, so for instance, here's a screenshot of the fees and funding page of University of Oxford. They have handy pages and tools that you can use to look for specific scholarships that suit you. So for instance, on this page, you can see that you're supposed to input all your details, what course are you applying to, what country you're from, and then they will automatically give you a long list of scholarships that you're eligible to apply for. Some of these scholarships you might be considered for automatically, in which case they will have that written. Some scholarships you'll have to apply to yourselves, in which case they'll have given you the relevant links for those pages. Um, So this is a very handy tool, but I think generally for a lot of universities and a lot of programs, you'll notice that there's no such tool. So this will require you to manually spend a lot of time and go over each page of every program that you're applying to. So you look at the university page, you look at their fees and funding page. They'll have some university wide scholarships. They may have financial aid information, which is very, very important. And then they have specific eligibility criteria for that. Sometimes your country may not be eligible at all. So make sure that you go through that in a lot of detail and very thoroughly. Then you go to your department that you're applying to, you look at the funding that they have. Sometimes, as mentioned, some of the corporate scholarships may be available to them. So for example, if they're working with a particular organization, they're doing projects with that organization, that organization may be providing funding to that particular department. In some cases, this may be attached to certain conditions. For example, you can only, in case of DPhil especially, you can only work on that particular project and field and research question then. But in some cases, it may also be open. Um, yeah, so I think I've covered most of this, but yeah, just to something to keep in mind is when you look, you need to look at their eligibility criteria in detail. You need to look at their application requirements in detail. You need to see if they align with the kind of degree and research that you're doing. So for instance, if you are interested in doing a DPhil in a certain field, but the funding is for a specific subfield within that field that does not align with your goals, then that's something that you'll have to look over very carefully and decide before applying. And obviously, your grant application will then be tailored to that particular very specific project. Um, so I think that covers most of what I have to say on internal funding. I will now hand it over to Talha to tell us specifically about the OPP scholarships that are specifically for Pakistani students, of course.
Wajeeha, thank you so much. Uh, Hello, everyone. My name is Talha Pirzada. I'm a lecturer in material science here at the University of Oxford. I'm also part of the Oxford Pakistan program, and I'll go through the funding opportunities that OPP has. But Vijay, I would just want to add one thing on departmental funding. Can you allow me to share my screen? This
Just give me a second, Talha.
related to DPhil application. So basically, departmental funding, in terms of departmental funding, what happens is there are funding opportunities that are specifically available for DPhil students at the department. So there'll be projects that would be funded at the department. So when students are looking for DPhil funding, they should also look on the department's website and see if there's any projects that are funded and apply to those projects as well directly. So going on the University of Oxford website, they can easily find funding opportunities in each department. Yep. Okay. In regards to the OPP,
Sorry, Talha, did you want to share your screen
yeah,
or should I
let me share my screen now if I have been given the opportunity. Okay. Uh, Hopefully you can all see my screen.
Yes,
Is it?
we can.
Okay. Is this the one with the Google one or the
Yeah, we can see the Google page.
Okay, excellent. Um, just to give you an example, so if you go Department of Materials and research areas, and then in research areas, these are the different research areas. Um, uh, Research funding opportunities. There would be let's look at might be give me 1 second. Um, Problem is they've changed the website since I last looked at it. Um, Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. So if you look over here, you can see postgraduate research projects available. So all these projects that you can see on here would actually have funding associated with it. So these two professors would be working on this project. So for example, effects of hydrogen on the mechanical properties of metals for nuclear fusion and hydrogen energy systems. You will see that this project's already funded, and you can go to submit your proposal to this project for this project, or even write to these professors. So in engineering and material science and in STEM subjects, you will have departmental funding for projects, and those project funding would be highlighted on the website. So do look at that and then apply for your DPhil, because you might have 20, 30 different projects that already have funding associated to it. And then when you contact these professors, you can talk to them about directly about the project that they already have funding for. So just that was just to give you an idea about what funding opportunity, departmental DPhil funding opportunities are available. In regards to the Oxford Pakistan program, Oxford Pakistan program was started about 3 to 4 years ago, and the main reason for that was to increase the representation of Pakistanis and British Pakistani students here at Oxford. And this year we were able to support 12 students, and alongside our funding, which was around 300K, we collaborated with the university and we were able to give around £650,000 of funding. The idea is to have enough funding for anyone who gets admitted into Oxford. They shouldn't really worry about the funding side of things, but we haven't reached that goal yet. It might be take us a fair few years, but we're working towards it. In regards to the deadlines related to the OPP funding, the first thing you have to do is secure an admission. So by applying beginning of January, by submitting your masters and DPhil applications, you can and obviously you can apply for that, and in April you usually hear back from the university whether you've gotten or you've secured a place or not. And then in April our funding application opens up, and then you can apply for different scholarships. All the scholarships are sort of cobbled together as OPP scholarships. So you can apply for the OPP scholarship through one form. There are some scholarships that have a regional requirement. For example, there's a scholarship on South Punjab where students from South Punjab are given preference. There's a scholarship under the name of Malala Scholarship where preference is given to women. There's another scholarship that we're launching this year that is specifically for students from Balochistan. So we have a number of scholarships that are based on disadvantaged backgrounds, but most of the scholarships are open. So once you apply in April, you'll get an interview call, or you'll get shortlisted, and then you'll have two interview stages. So the first one would be an initial interview, and then which would have 2 or 3 panelists, and then there would be second interview process, which would have 4 to 5 different panelists. All of them will be fellows at Lady Margaret Hall. And then you'll hear back from us whether you've received a partial funding or a full funding for the scholarship. At the moment, we don't really support MBA students because of the fee requirement. But other than that, most degrees are supported by the OPP graduate scholarship. These scholarships are supported by different donors. So you can find out about those donors on our website. But uh, yeah, so some support partial scholarship, some support full scholarship. But if you are eligible for full scholarships, we'll cobble up the money and we'll try to obviously support you as much as possible. I think that's about it really. Wajeeha, you applied for the scholarship. Maybe you might have anything to add towards the scholarships. So in terms of just the eligibility criteria, I think the three main things we're looking for. First one is you have to be a Pakistani or a British Pakistani. Second thing is we really want the impact of your research to be the impact of your research to be linked to Pakistan, and how you can obviously benefit Pakistan in the long term. There is no bond that we sign in terms of that you have to go back to Pakistan, but we really want to see how your research or how your degree is going to impact Pakistan. And the third thing which we're always looking for is the mindset of opening doors for others. So how you think about creating opportunities for others, that's one of the main things that we're looking for in OPP scholars. Excellent. I think I'll hand it back to Wajeeha. She can add anything to it if she wants, and then and I'm happy to answer any questions, whether right now or at the end of it.
Right, thanks, Talha. I think I'll just add that I think one of the major reasons why OPP is such a great initiative is because um, it looks at the eligibility criteria and the selection process that Talha has already mentioned, but people from all sorts of fields can apply. And they do have a very diverse cohort if you look at the profiles from either of the 3 years that they've now been running. And I think this is really important, particularly for social science and humanities students, because as Talha has already mentioned, and as Hamza will also go over, there are a lot of different opportunities. For instance, corporate, these kind of research projects for STEM students, but there are lesser opportunities in of these sort for social science and humanities students. So I think for those of you interested in going into those fields, OPP is a great scholarship. At Oxford, particularly, there are also a couple of others. Those are smaller. Usually, they have one scholarship every year, but there are a couple of other scholarships as well that you should look into that are Oxford specific. And then I think on a beyond Oxford, I think for social science and humanities scholars in particular, you should definitely consider scholarships by other trusts and governments. So, as mentioned, scholarships like Achievement, Commonwealth, and then Rhodes Trust and these sort of other trusts. Wikinown, which has a scholarship for Cambridge and Oxford. So I think these are the kind of sources that you should be looking at. And now I think I'll hand over to Hamza for his expertise on external funding as well as STEM subjects in particular.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, Hamza. Sorry, this is just a list of some internal master scholarships as an example for you to look into. So these are for different universities. I think we're a bit biased towards Oxford in this panel, but these are just examples of the kinds of scholarships that are available in different universities. So University of Sussex, LSE. But again, the key is to research and go into the individual websites so you can find these kinds of scholarship that would fit your level of study, your degree, and then your course, of course. Yeah, over to you, Hamza.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Wajeeha and Dr. Talha. So I'm currently doing an MSc in Advanced Computer Science here at Oxford, and I'm studying on the Wikinoon Scholarship, which is another external scholarship. I'll talk more about those. But just to quickly go over these internal scholarships as well, I want to first come up with a structure that's usually more helpful when applying for scholarships. So you want to be more bottom up. So you want to first look at the scholarships that your particular program has, maybe at a university of choice. Then you want to look at the general scholarships that a university has, and then you want to look at external scholarships. Obviously, this doesn't mean you leave any out, but this is just so that you're more focused on your programs, and then you're looking at universities on a larger scale as well. So just for the internal scholarships, there's there's some universities which actually do have a lot of internal scholarships. So maybe start by looking at some of the bigger names because they usually have more funding. So UCL, I think UCL has a global master scholarship in London that's also geared particularly towards people from low-income backgrounds. Queen Mary has, I think, a scholarship by the name of Seckford House Scholarship. So there's many in London that actually do have some funding for graduate students, especially those that are not home students. But just look at university internal programs by the websites and by your own program. Make sure to, as Dr. Talha pointed out, look at projects or certain scholarships within them. But just moving ahead, so the big source for funding usually within Europe and especially in the UK are national research councils. For instance, in the UK, you have UKRI, which is the UK Research Council. And these are specialized trusts that are set up with the express purpose of creating funding for research at universities. So while they're usually targeted towards PhD students, they also sometimes cater towards master students with research focuses on them. So just look into that. But usually they guarantee funding for the duration of your PhD. Um, they also usually give living costs, etc. Now, these vary according to which program you're applying to. But in the UK, at least, these are quite common. And then you'll also find that most of the PhDs that are not funded by professors themselves, they will be funded by national research councils. So in these cases, you don't have to apply for anything outside of your program. Usually you're considered on your own. But I would recommend that whatever university or program you're applying to, just look at what their funding sources are, and they'll have written that the UKRI or any National Research Council funds this program. But yeah, this is common within the UK, within Europe, and in the US as well. They have NSF fellowships, but they're more exclusive. They're also government funded scholarships, but they're for students who are like, even within those who are funded, therefore like people who are doing like really good work. Let's look into all of these. Can we go to the next slide? Wajeeha, can we go to the next slide? Yeah, thank you. Okay, so these are ones, the previous ones, you got considered for them just by application, but there are some which are sponsored by external organizations, and they're usually offered in partnership with the university itself. So in many cases, you apply to the university and you apply to the scholarship, but they're in communication with each other. In some cases, you apply to the university and then entirely independently you apply to the scholarship. So for instance, you've all heard of the Chevening Scholarship, the Commonwealth Scholarships. These are some of the big names. Usually you have to apply to them independently. They have their own review process. And then for some, you also have to apply 1 year in advance. So just make sure you're looking at deadlines for these. Some, for instance, the Rhodes Scholarship, the Weidenfeld-Hoffman Scholarships, these, just like OPP, require you to both get into the university of choice and also then get the scholarship. So just be mindful of that because then you have to, first of all, obviously get in, but then you also have to compete within students within Oxford to get that scholarship. So just be very particular about the application criteria of these scholarships. There's also the Ertugrul Scholarship here at Oxford. I'm just going over these very briefly, but usually the format for these are you check their eligibility, you see which programs they support. They do not support all programs, so be particular about that. And then they have some specific criteria that they're looking for in their applicants. So try to customize your profile and your application so that you're meeting the standards they're talking about. If you're applying a year in advance, maybe focus on things that could make you more appealing as a candidate for these scholarships, and then try to apply for them. They usually have an essay component and an interview component. We can talk about those in more detail, but they usually go over whatever the scholarship is trying to promote and see if you're a good match for that. I think the OPP also has a similar process. But yeah, but these are just some of those. There's lots of those, lots of these scholarships. Just go over them. There's some of these are institution specific. So the Wikinoon Scholarship, this is an external slash in partnership with the university scholarship that's tenable at Cambridge and Oxford. So that's good scholarship, great scholarships. I believe they're also tenable at a few universities, but Bristol has a big award for them. And then the Gates Cambridge Scholarship is only tenable at Cambridge. But you'll have to go over these one by one. And usually the best way is either to go at many websites which have a catalog of all the scholarships that are available for international students, or just go to each university's website, go to the funding section and go over each scholarship and make a tracker of whether you're eligible for it or not and what they're looking for. You can go to the next slide, Vijay. Okay, so now just going into more of a geographical split. So many scholarships in Europe are grouped together. So for instance, if you're looking at Sweden or Netherlands or Germany, there will be many research councils like the UKRI that give scholarships not on the basis of a specific university, but just on the basis of the fact that you're applying to this country in question. I think DAAD in Germany is one such avenue. So the best way to look at these is like search for a scholarship, search for a country's name and look for scholarships within that country. Now, this isn't so common in the US and many other places, but in Europe, this is really common. So you should, again, pick a country and then just search for scholarships within that country. It's usually more helpful to make a list of 2 to 3 universities, top universities within each European country, and then look at which scholarships cover programs within that university. And usually what happens is you'll see that many of those programs aren't just limited to that one university. They're also applicable at many other universities within that country, and they're part of a larger scholarship scheme. So just try to look at many different countries because some have more lenient policies than others. Plus, it's entirely possible that you will be able to pay less at one European country as compared to what you might be paying even after you had a partial scholarship at some other European country. So just make sure you look at a variety of options and see which one is more suitable for you. Can go to the next slide. So some of the more common ones are the Erasmus scholarships. These are usually their funding is quite generous. They have a stipend and they also fully fund your education. Plus, they're also not limited to any one particular country in Europe. You can go to multiple different countries. Just make sure you meet their deadlines. So they have varying deadlines based on which program you're applying to. It's best to go to their website. They have many, many programs, and then just look at which one you want to apply to and then see what their deadline is. They also require standardized tests, I believe. So make sure you have given those in advance before applying to them. In case they ask for it, you should check each year they update their requirements. So just make sure you're eligible for them in advance. Next slide. The US usually has a lot more funding than other places, and that's partially because in addition to scholarships, there's also opportunities to get funding from departments or professors, and they're usually more lenient towards that. So these are some of the known scholarship schemes. I think the Fulbright one is the most well-known one, but you have to apply 1 year in advance, so just look at that. But then there's also some scholarships from big companies. So for instance, I know Microsoft has a scholarship. Google has some scholarships. Google DeepMind has some scholarships. They're also present within the UK. But just be very careful about these industrial scholarships because they usually have a very high academic criteria. And just bear in mind that when you're applying to these places, you're competing with some really good students from other places in the world who are actually from some really well-renowned institutions. So just don't rely on these as a primary source of funding. But do bear in mind that even if you haven't explicitly applied for these scholarships, you might probably be eligible for them. But the external ones, the ones you apply for independently at these organizations, look out for them. Sometimes they're not advertised on a university's website, and instead they're advertised on the organization's website. So for instance, many of these scholarships, the Google Lime Scholarship, might not be advertised within university websites, but they will be up on the organization's page. You might have to search for these. But the US also has a lot of good internal scholarships. So if you get in and if you perhaps talk to a professor, if they're willing to take you up as a teaching assistant or a research assistant, in many universities, that means that you automatically get a waiver on your tuition fee. So make sure you also look at what the working policy at your university is in the US because it could be very lenient in many cases. Next slide, please. And those are more of the scholarship-oriented funding opportunities where you're given that money, usually with no conditions, except when you have to do some research part-time, but that's different. Outside of that, obviously, you can get a loan, but you have to pay this back usually. And they usually have special rates, though. They're not offered at the same rate as regular loans within the country are. Some people choose to crowdfund. That's rare. You can go for it if you like. It could help you partially or not at all. Some people also choose to work part-time. Now, if you're in the UK at least, and if you're paying the international fee, this means you won't probably be able to pay your tuition fee back just by working. So you want to look into how much these actually pay, how many hours you're allowed to work legally, and then think about these. If you're thinking of coming and just making money while working and then paying off your tuition fee, I would take this with a hint of skepticism because usually it becomes very hard, especially if you're on an academically rigorous program. So just be aware of these opportunities. See them more as an opportunity to supplement whatever funding source you have as compared to letting them be the primary source of funding you have while you're here. And lastly, in the UK, it's relatively rare, especially during master's program. But some professors, especially in the US and maybe in Europe too, perhaps, they take up research assistants or teaching assistants, and they usually provide good stipends and tuition fee waivers. If you're able to get such a role, that would be great. But especially if you're coming for a 1 year program, don't think that, okay, I'll get a teaching assistant role once I get there, because these are relatively rare. And if you're here for so little time, it's usually a bit difficult to actually do get that role with some professor, because you're also competing with lots of PhD students within departments who rely on these roles for funding opportunities. So just be a bit careful about coming in with the expectation of getting these roles. But I would say focus more on creating a large net of scholarships that you can apply to at various places and try to rely on them as your primary source of finance. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, this is more about PhD degrees. I'll talk about it from from my own experiences applying for PhDs, but Dr. Talha can especially add on to it, especially since he's done his PhD. So usually, especially in the US, tuition fees for PhD students have already been waived, especially because they have there's no concept of paying for a PhD in the US. But this might not be the case in UK and Europe, especially in the UK. Usually, there's the expectation that you will pay for it, and you don't actually pay for it because some research council or some professor is actually hosting you in their lab, so they're paying for it. But generally in the UK and in Europe, the expectation is that the PhD is a paid for program. They usually provide a stipend, they provide healthcare services. It's treated more like a job when you've got funding as compared to an educational degree. So maybe Dr. Thala can share more details about it as well. But yeah, go ahead, Dr. Thala.
Yeah, thank you so much, Hamza. Just to add on to what Hamza has alluded to, in the UK, most PhDs would be funded, but there will be cases in which PhDs are not funded, and you might choose to come in to those PhD programs without any funding and hope that you will get the funding along the way. It is very rare that you secure funding. So if unless you have half or 75% of funding, I won't recommend that you come over and do part-time jobs and work and get TA-ships, because PhD is also a full-time program. So when you think about part-time jobs and teaching TA-ships in the UK, it'll just be financial assistance. So it could boost your income, but it won't really solve your major DPhil or PhD problem, because the fee is still quite a lot for international students, around £30,000 plus the stipend. With in some programs, the fee might be a lot more. So focus on securing the funding, securing the fees at least before you come to these programs. For social science, there might be less fundings, but less funding opportunities. But as Hamza said, you have the UKRI councils, you have economic research council, so on and so forth. So look at those councils and see what funding opportunities you can get hold of. But I would not recommend coming to a PhD program without at least your fee being fully funded within the UK. And then again, all these opportunities will still be available, but they're supplementary. You might be able to, I think the limit is 20 hours a week in the UK. So you, with the full-time PhD degree, you won't be able to work 20 hours every week. So again, it might cover most of your stipend, but look at funding opportunities and make sure that you have funding secured before you come.
Yeah, thank you for that. So yeah, these are some of the sources that you might look for. These are those that provide you funding without you having to work, jobs or etc. So I talked about the research councils. There's many foundations as well, like the National Science Foundation, Ford Foundation, Fulbright Foundation. These provide funding, but they're competitive usually. And just bear in mind that competitive has a special connotation here. Competitive means not only have you gotten into this program for a PhD at some good university or some institute, but now you have to compete with all those people who have gotten admissions to get this funding. So just think about this when applying for these scholarships. You're no longer just someone who has applied from Pakistan for a PhD. You're now someone who's competing with everybody else who has gotten into that PhD program. So just bear that in mind when you're applying for these, because these are quite competitive. Uh, but there's also many grants. So Dr. Talla talked about project-specific grants in the beginning as well. So just look at those. Some are just institutional. So if some institution might just be sponsoring research in a particular field or a particular area, and then some might be more specific. So they might sponsor a particular project, as you talked about. So just look into those. Some of the information is usually on the website of the particular project you're working on, but sometimes certain institutions like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation might have some information about this on their website when they're specifically looking to fund people who are working on a particular thing. This is especially useful when you're looking at PhD projects. And then obviously there's the faculty secured grants. These are especially pervasive within the US. And also in the UK, where professors are specifically looking to hire people on their own projects. In that case, they will fund you. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah, so just be careful about the timing of your stipend. So in the US, it's usually guaranteed that you'll be funded for the entirety of your PhD. In the UK, especially, that funding comes with a time limit. So many scholarships specify that they'll fund you for, let's say, 3.5 years or 3 years. Now, the problem with that is if you go over that, and it's a very likely possibility that your PhD sometimes does go over that, then they will not fund you in many cases, and they might choose not to extend your funding, in which case, obviously, you might have to rely on some other external sources. Maybe your professors might have to fund you, but also look at programs which only like offer funding for 1 or 2 years. Be careful about those because that's usually too less for a PhD, and they're usually depending on you to then look for other funding opportunities. So just be careful about that. And also you might want to take a break from between your PhD. I know some people extend it to 5, 6, 7 years in the UK as well. So just be careful about such programs and be mindful of how long the funding is for. But also many of these funding opportunities, especially the ones that are coming not from any scholarship granting authority, they expect you to teach alongside. So you're working as a teacher, as a teaching assistant. Remember that that's a full-time job. So they do expect you to work for that. It's part of the 20-hour work hour limit for your visa. So if you have gotten funding that specifically asks you to teach, just remember that that cuts down on the time that you can work for otherwise within the remit of your visa. So don't think that you can have multiple jobs alongside your teaching position. But also bear in mind that sometimes you can get funding on the basis of your dissertation or on your research. You can keep applying for grants and they can extend your funding as well. So just make sure you have a look at whichever lab you're applying to or whichever professor you're working for. If they do apply, if they do work that is eligible for grants, or if they have a lot of grants available to them, then that usually means you have a higher chance for applying, for getting funding later on through your program. But it's also very much a program thing. So some STEM programs have guaranteed 3 to 4 year programs. Over there, it's easier to get funding, firstly, because STEM has more funding generally, but also because if it's a fixed time period, they're able to create larger amounts of scholarships for students who are working with them versus some maybe niche programs that take longer, which have an expected timeline of 5 to 6 years. Maybe in that case, especially if they're not within STEM subjects, they usually have very little funding available. So also bear that in mind when you're applying to those programs. They might be more selective with funding. Maybe 10 people might get in, but they would be expecting to only sponsor 1 or 2 people in that program. So just bear that in mind when you're applying to these programs. Obviously, you maximize your chances when you apply to a program which generally has more funding, apply to work with a professor who generally has more funding, or apply to work in a lab which generally has more funding. So you have to choose where you apply. And Dr. Talha can maybe add on to this as well later on. Can we go to the next slide? But just as far as it goes, how do you search for these scholarships and how do you make sure you make a good application? Just go at your university's website, target university's website, look at the list of scholarships. We've talked about it. Unfortunately, there's really no way around this. Scholarship opportunities are different at every university, and you're best off just targeting universities and their specific scholarships. But what I'll emphasize a bit more on is that scholarships usually have a criteria, and they're looking for people who meet that criteria. And usually if these are merit scholarships, which in most cases they are, it means that you need to have something in your profile that goes beyond just coming from Pakistan or having a certain background. So just make sure that when you're writing your application, you're emphasizing those things, or you have an application that really does meet those criteria. For instance, I believe somebody asked about this in the questions as well, but there's a scholarship by the name of Weidenfeld Hoffman, I believe. As far as I recall, that scholarship emphasizes leadership and stuff like moral philosophy, having some background with that. And that will usually reflect in the kind of applicants they do offer scholarships to. So make sure you actually do have a background with those criteria that they're mentioning, because that will determine the chances of whether you'll get it or not. And then many of these scholarships also have an interview process. I believe the OPP also has an interview process. These guys can talk about it more. But they will question you about those things and about your profile generally. And it's a competitive process. So Usually when you're applying for scholarships, there'd be a couple of things that are common. So maybe leadership skills, academic excellence, uh, and just having a desire to like do something that aligns with the scholarship's objectives. So make sure before you go into an interview, before you write your application, you kind of match those requirements as well. But that's generally a broad overview. Now, if we have specific questions, all of us are here to answer those.
Thank you so much, Talha and Hamza, for this very, very comprehensive overview. I think you have both have covered pretty much all the aspects, but we'll now open the floor to questions. So if any of you has any question, please feel free to raise your hand, and then you can unmute yourself when you're called upon, or just send your questions in the chat while we're here. So I think there was a question on the Weidenfield scholarship that Hamza has already covered. There's another question in the chat specifically about OPP and whether it covers more business-related degrees such as MBAs. And is there any preference when it comes to the different scholarships offered under OPP? So I think Talha, you can share more about that.
Hey, thanks, Wajeeha, and thank you, Hamza, for running such a great session. So basically, we currently don't have enough funds to fund an MBA degree. That might change in the future because we might be looking at partnerships with the business school to see if they can support the scholarship program, similar to what we did with the MPP program, partially the MPP program, which has a fee of £70,000, is now funded by the Vatican School of Government, and we support around 45 to £50,000. So hopefully in the future, if we have a similar mechanism in place with the business school, we might be able to fund that. Okay, and is there any preference when it comes to different scholarships offered under OPP? So there's one scholarship, Malala scholarship, where preference is given to female applicants. So obviously there's a preference there. Then there's another scholarship there where preference is given to students from South Punjab, and then there's another scholarship where preference is given to Balochi students. But these are just 3 scholarships. There's still around 8 or 9 others where you have no preference other than your merit, your financial need, and your commitment to Pakistan.
Right. Thank you so much, Talha. There's another question on OPP specifically, which is how does OPP select candidates, and is it to get admission in Oxford and then consider one's application? So I think that we've already mentioned that the
Exactly.
prerequisite to applying to OPP is that you need to have been admitted to the University of Oxford. And then there are a couple of questions um, on, I think, more logistical bits. So can you get your personal essays reviewed by applicants who have been awarded such scholarships? So specifically related to if you're asking for the Pakistan Graduate Mentorship Program. So in that case, we have tried to map the mentors and mentees in such a way that either their fields align or the scholarships align. So they will be able to guide you on your specific essays. For some scholarships like Achieving, we've already run a special sort of program where we had Achieving essays reviewed by Achieving scholars. But I would also say on this that, and this is something that I've personally done for my program as well as even for the OPP scholarship, which is that you should network and you should reach out to people. LinkedIn is actually a surprisingly good medium for this. So look up people who are doing the course that you're doing, look up people who are on the same scholarship and just hit them up, send them a nice polite message where you tell them where you're coming from, what you're looking for, why you need their help. Usually in my experience, if you send a nice message like that, people are very, very approachable and helpful. So for instance, I had my admissions essay. So for my course, I had it reviewed by someone who was studying that course that year, and they sent me a very, very helpful feedback that really helped me, I think, improve my application. So just network and look for people who have been on the same scholarships. You also see a lot of posts on LinkedIn, by the way, nowadays, where people like a lot. I've seen a lot of streaming scholars themselves post that they are willing to take, let's say, up to five mentees this year whose essays they will review. So just keep an eye out for that. I think that's a really helpful way to have your essays reviewed. And again, just please feel free to raise your hands or send more questions in the chat. Otherwise, we can move towards wrapping up. I don't see any hands, and I think we've covered the questions in the chat. Okay. Soha, please go ahead.
Hello, very informative sessions. I didn't really have any questions until now. I wanted to ask, so because you told us today that we have to go through all the website pages and the departmental funding. So what if someone's done all that and they still don't find scholarships for their subject? Thank you.
Dr. Talha, are you going to say
Yeah,
something?
carry on, Hamza.
Okay, so Soha, can I ask you which program you applied to? Yeah.
So I basically applied for master's last year,
So yeah,
and I
sorry.
also applied for a PhD. However, there were no scholarships for me.
For your program specifically, or did you not get a scholarship?
For my program, I never even got to the point where I could apply for a scholarship. For example, there's obviously chevening and there's other, but I don't have work experience, so I'm not eligible for those.
Okay. I think there's two scenarios in this. The first is that maybe you didn't look extensively enough, or you didn't look at I'll talk about this briefly. Uh, second is that maybe the program you applied to is just so niche that there aren't enough scholarships, that there actually aren't any scholarships available for it. If this is the case, then I would always recommend that maybe if you're applying next year, maybe look for a program that's closely related, but not exactly that program, because then there might be funding for that. But in this case, there isn't. I'll give you an example too. I know that some people within Oxford, so there's many programs that are quite closely aligned. So it's possible that if you're majoring in anthropology, social anthropology, you might be studying many of the things that you could also be studying while doing, for instance, an MPhil in development studies. So there's that common point there. But the amount of funding that are available to both departments, these might vary. So if you're looking for a specific program and there is no scholarship generally available for that, then maybe just look at similarly aligned programs. The second scenario is that maybe a particular university or location didn't have funding for your program. In that case, I'd say that you should maybe look at other places or other locations geographically as well. So I don't know if you've looked at the Erasmus program, but usually if you can think of any subject area, Erasmus has some scholarship that is available for a program closely related to it. So maybe expand your net and look at more locations and more programs. Obviously, if you have any specific major that you want to discuss or any program, I'm available if you want to reach out to me personally later on as well.
Okay, so thank you for that question, and thank you, Hamza. I think we can take one more question, which is on BS statistics specifically. And if you guys have any recommendations for which scholarship someone who's in the last year of BS can apply, if you're in your last year, that's specifically for Oxford. But if you guys know of any other specific scholarships or any advice on basically what somebody in their last year of BS should be doing at this point.
I think they should really focus on their profile, and they should um apply to the relevant courses in the UK, US, and Europe. And then obviously looking at what the requirements of, because this is quite a broad question. It's all about building your profile, making your profile good enough for you to actually really compete on this level. And if there's any help you need, sign up for the mentorship program. We're here to help. We'll guide you in how to write that application, what to do in terms of making that application really stand out. It's all about creating a profile that would be really, really appealing for people who are reviewing those your application.
I'll add one more thing, which I think is also related to another question here. Just because you did something in your undergrad doesn't mean that the only thing you can do for your postgrad is a continuation of that field. You can switch your programs in your master's. So if you've, for instance, done a BS in statistics, you could easily transition into a BS economics program or a master's in economics, mathematics, something like this. So don't just limit yourself to whatever you did in your undergrad. Just as long as you have the right experiences, you can always transition.
Yes, and I think there's another question, Hamza, that you just mentioned, which is asking how you know if you're eligible for a particular course, whether it's directly related or not. So I'm not sure what you mean by the last bit. If you're talking about it being related to your undergraduate degree, in which case Hamza has already answered. Regarding eligibility, I'd just say again, look at the course page, look at the program page. In some cases, um, the eligibility criteria may not, for instance, if it's a master's in development economics, it may not require you to have an economics degree, but usually they will require you to have maybe, let's say, 4 courses in statistics, mathematics, microeconomics, something like that. But it does not necessarily always require a particular degree. So just look at the eligibility criteria of the specific program, because this is a very subjective thing that varies, I think, program to program. Um,
Yeah, just
Shanush?
sorry, one thing I want to add to that, Wajeeha. Yeah, so usually there's no one size fits all. Many programs do list what they require as a previous requirement, but even if you don't exactly meet that requirement, many times they'll have an interview for that. So for instance, my program, an MSc in Advanced Computer Science at Oxford, for its requirements, it had either computer science or mathematics. But I majored in electrical engineering during my undergrad. So I had an interview where the point of which was basically to ensure that I had a sufficient background in mathematics. And usually, if you have a good profile, they'll do something to figure out if you're the right candidate or not. So because there's so many people applying from so many different places with different educational systems, those requirements aren't rigid, but you should just sort of know what they're looking for in potential applicants. Thank you.
Thanks, Hamza. Shanush, you can go ahead, and then I think we can wrap up. Shanush, you want to unmute yourself? Okay. Okay, I think we have covered all the questions in the chat. There's one more question on whether OPP considers 1+1 masters. Will it consider 1+1 masters program in the future? I think Talha can comment on that. But currently, as Talha already mentioned, they fund 1-year programs. If you want to apply to a 2-year program like an MPhil, in that case, you should still apply to OPP because they do consider it, and you may be eligible for partial funding. But Talha can comment whether they plan to open to 1+1 masters in the future.
So just thanks, Wajeeha. You sort of highlighted most of the things. So in terms of an MPhil program, we will support the student for 1 year at least, and then because our funding is on rolling basis, you can apply to the funding for a second year. For a 1+1, that's I think similar to MPP plus an MBA. Again, if you're applying for the first year and you're applying for an MPP, you can apply for it. But if you're in the second part of the program and you're applying for an MBA, we'll only look at your application for 1 year. That's one of the key things that we're kind of stuck with as well because of our funding cycle at the moment. But yeah.
All right, just gonna check once again if Shanush can unmute herself and ask. Otherwise, we'll just wrap up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you so much. Firstly, because last year I got admission in US universities, like with the help of my mentor from OPP. So my question now is that, last time we received with the help of my mentor, of course, I received an an offer letter and got almost like 70% of the scholarship from the university. And then to cover rest of the 30%, we created a GoFundMe campaign, but still like it's very difficult for us to reach the goal. So my question now is like what do you suggest? Like would it be sane to just take the student loan and study, or quit the admission and start from the scratch to different university and in a different country? Or like, are there any other scholarship that I might consider? Because in the US I have seen that when you when you have the interest stamp on your visa, then you can apply for the scholarships that are available in the university and outside. So my question is like, as I'm in Pakistan, so can I apply for the scholarship so that I can easily go there and study? Thank you.
I think your question is very specific. First of all, congratulations on getting 70% scholarship. And if it's a couple of years long program, which program is it, Shanuz?
Yeah, that's Masters in Development Practice.
Okay, Masters in Development Practice. If you
Yes.
have 70% funding, I don't know how much GoFundMe that you receive, but if you have 70 to 80% funding, you could actually go there and try your luck and find out and apply for hardship grants and other things as well. It's a risk worth taking. Whether you should apply again this year, yes, obviously you should keep on applying. But the specific questions you're asking, we might not be the best people to answer that because we won't know the specific situation in that university and what sort of, because every university has hardship grants, they have internal funding, they have departmental specific funding. We can talk more about generic things, but I think if you have 70 to 80% funding, it's definitely worth taking the plunge. And in the meantime, keep applying through this cycle as well. And if that's the best option that you still have, then and you feel comfortable, then I would say go for it. Hamza, Wajeeha, do you wanna?
Yeah, I'll just add this one thing that based on just all the people I know who have went to the US for their masters, getting 70 to 80% scholarship is really rare. It's unheard of. It's very rare that, people just get a scholarship for their masters in the US. So just think about how better you can do by applying next year if it's even possible to do better than this. But you're in a good position as compared to many other US applicants.
Exactly. And even if you worst come worst, you have to take a loan. That's not the end of the world. I think, as Hamza said, I agree with him. It's a very good opportunity or a very good situation to be in.
Thank you so much for your suggestions.
All right. I think we can wrap up now. Thank you so much, Talha and Hamza, for taking our time and giving such a comprehensive overview for both DPhil and master's application. To all those who joined today, thank you as well. Please note that we'll have this session recording up in a few days. And next weekend, we have 2 more sessions on navigating standardized tests and on writing SOPs. I think that session is particularly important because it's not just for your course in the particular program that you're applying to, but that session I believe will also really help you in drafting your scholarship applications and essays. So hope to see you all next week, and thank you once again everybody for joining.
Thank you so much for organizing this, Wajeeha, and thank you so much for joining, Hamza.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye bye everyone.